On a cold London evening, as the bells of St. Paul's echoed through the mist, something extraordinary unfolded. It wasn't just a vigil, it was a silent reckoning for the House of Windsor. Catherine stood beneath the ancient arches, her presence calm yet commanding, her face illuminated by the flicker of candlelight that seemed to dance in rhythm with destiny. Around her, the cathedral breathed centuries of history walls that had witnessed coronations, farewells, and whispered betrayals. But tonight was different. Tonight, the monarchy stood on the edge of an unseen precipice, and the world was unknowingly watching it tilt. Beneath the hymns and the solemn prayers, there was tension, quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. It rippled through the pews like a warning. Every detail of the night seemed choreographed by fate. The hush of the crowd outside, the shiver in the air, the faint echo of footsteps on marble floors, all building towards something unscripted, something no royal press secretary could contain. St. Paul's Cathedral had always been a symbol of endurance, faith, and divine order. Yet, in that very sanctity, politics and prophecy intertwined. The king's absence until that very moment had stirred unease. The archbishop's tone faltered as though even he sensed that this gathering wasn't merely a memorial, it was a moment of transformation waiting to declare itself. And at the centre of it all stood Catherine. She was the picture of composure, every movement precise, every glance deliberate. Yet behind her calm exterior, there was something electric, an aura that both comforted and unsettled. Her elegance was no longer passive, it commanded the room. Even the senior royals, seasoned in suppressing emotion, seemed unable to hide their unease. Their eyes darted, their hands fidgeted, their silence betrayed them. It wasn't defiance that filled the air, it was anticipation. A shift was happening, silent yet seismic, and Catherine's very stillness became its symbol. The press, stationed at the edge of reverence and opportunism, could sense it too. Their cameras clicked not in ceremony but in curiosity, capturing what they couldn't yet name, that subtle change in posture, the unspoken distance between the king's sons, the faint tremor in the queen consort's smile. Something was off script, and everyone could feel it. Some whispered that a statement might come. Others dismissed it as baseless rumor, but history often disguises its most pivotal moments as accidents of timing, and tonight would be no exception. When Charles finally arrived, he didn't glide in with the polished rhythm of the royal ceremony. He entered late, unannounced, cutting through the vigil's order like a shadow over flame. Heads turned, the choir hesitated. Even the bell's echo seemed to pause. For the first time in living memory, a monarch entered St. Paul's not as the symbol of stability, but as a man walking into his reckoning. His expression carried fatigue and finality. Catherine's eyes met him not with rebellion, but with understanding. It was brief, but it was enough to tell the world that the monarchy's balance had shifted. The ceremony continued, but it no longer belonged to the church. It belonged to destiny. Every note, every breath, every heartbeat felt synchronized to an unfolding truth. Those within the cathedral sensed it, though few could name it. They didn't yet know that centuries of tradition were quietly being dismantled before their eyes. They didn't yet realize that beneath the mourning and reverence, the future of the British monarchy was being redrawn in real time. Catherine shone like a symbol of grace, yet the light around her revealed far more than beauty. It revealed power, purpose, and inevitability. And as the final prayer echoed through the vaulted ceiling, the atmosphere transformed. There was reverence, yes, but also something heavier, the collective awareness that history had just changed its course. The vigil was to honor the past. Instead, it had awakened the future. The royal family left in dignified silence, but the whispers had already begun quiet, anxious, electric. Something had happened that couldn't be undone. But the vigil was only the stage where what came next would expose the monarchy's most guarded secret. Before the vigil, whispers had already haunted the palace halls. Advisers warned that King Charles's health and leadership were faltering, but what truly terrified them was what, or rather who, came next. Amid royal silence, an alternative plan had begun to take form, one that challenged centuries of inheritance and loyalty. It was a plan that could preserve the monarchy, but only by breaking its oldest rule. For those within the gilded corridors of power, the question was no longer whether change was coming, but who would be standing when it did. Behind the thick curtains of Clarence House, tension simmered beneath the calm of royal routine. Aides, who once spoke with certainty, now whispered behind closed doors, passing notes and exchanging knowing glances. The king, long burdened by duty, found himself at the mercy of time and expectation. His doctors remained discreet, but his fatigue had not gone unnoticed. What had once been dismissed as exhaustion now raised deeper fears, not for his health, but for the stability of the throne itself. The machinery of the monarchy had begun to turn, slowly and silently, searching for the next sovereign shadow before the present one had even faded. The ghost of Queen Elizabeth still lingered in every decision, every argument. Her portrait, her memory, her very name invoked like a divine question. What would Elizabeth have done? It was both comfort and condemnation, a reminder that her reign was not just a chapter in history, but a standard none could meet. Charles had waited his entire life for this crown, yet now it weighed heavier than ever. His reign, though still in its youth, already trembled under comparison. Every stumble, every misstep, was measured against the legacy of his mother's perfection. The Queen had ruled with quiet certainty. Charles ruled under the echo of her ghost. And then there was William, the heir apparent, yet visibly reluctant. His public demeanour projected duty, but those close to him knew his hesitation. He was a man torn between the life he wanted and the destiny he could not refuse. His devotion to family often clashed with his father's demands and the palace's expectations. But while William wavered, Catherine began to rise not through ambition, but through unshakable composure. Every speech, every appearance, every moment of grace drew people toward her. The public adored her, the establishment noticed her, and the king, in moments of reflection, began to see her not just as the future queen consort, but perhaps as something greater. Among his inner circle, debate became fierce. There were those who still clung to tradition, who believed the line of succession must remain untouched, no matter the cost. Others, more pragmatic, whispered of modern necessity. The world needs stability, one advisor dared to say, and she is stable. The statement was treasonous in spirit, but logical in form. The monarchy's survival depended not on blood, but on belief, and Catherine had captured the people's belief more powerfully than any monarch in a generation. Thus began the secret meetings, late-night gatherings at Clarence House, cloaked in discretion and denial. Codenamed Operation Continuum, it was framed as a contingency plan, a safeguard for continuity. But those who attended knew better. It was a blueprint for transition, one that redefined inheritance as choice, not birthright. Drafts of documents circulated quietly, phrased in vague language but holding explosive implications. Some saw it as a betrayal of royal blood, others saw it as evolution, a necessary leap for survival in a modern world that no longer bowed blindly. The vigil at St. Paul's, it seemed, was never meant to be a simple act of remembrance. It was the stage for revelation, chosen with symbolic precision. The sacred and the political would merge beneath its arches. The king's decision, though veiled in ceremony, was already set in motion, and while the world would watch in reverence, believing it was witnessing devotion, it would, in truth, be witnessing transformation. The vigil was no longer a ritual of mourning, it was the quiet prelude to a royal coup. As the world bowed its head in prayer, the king prepared to rewrite royal destiny. When Charles stepped toward the podium, no one expected him to speak. For decades, royal vigils had been moments of reflection, not revolution. They were sacred pauses in time, occasions for reverence, not revelation. Yet, as the king's steady figure emerged from the shadow of the altar, the murmurs fell silent. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The candlelight trembled, casting a faint halo across his face, but his eyes carried none of the serenity expected from a monarch at prayer. They were searching, almost burdened by the knowledge of something irreversible. And when his hand touched the edge of the podium, centuries of royal silence broke. The cathedral held its breath, the choir stilled, the organ quieted, and the faint hum of the cameras became the only sound left in the vast chamber. Charles began to speak softly, his tone solemn, deliberate yet strangely calm, as though rehearsed in a dream he'd had for years. "We gather tonight not only to honour those who came before," he said, his voice echoing through the nave, "but to acknowledge that time does not bow to crowns. It demands change, and we must answer." The words struck with quiet thunder. In that moment, every tradition, every expectation that had defined royal life began to tremble. He continued, his phrasing uncharacteristically poetic, almost prophetic. "The monarchy," he said, pausing as though to steady the weight of what came next, "cannot live only by blood, it must live by light. It is time for light to lead." There, it was a sentence so measured, yet so loaded, that even the most seasoned courtiers couldn't mask their confusion. Light. The word lingered in the air, too abstract to dismiss, too intentional to ignore. Some assumed it was metaphorical, a reference to hope, renewal, faith, but then his gaze shifted, landing for the briefest moment on Catherine. That was when the realization began to spread slow at first, then like a spark catching dry tinder. He meant her. The audience's composure cracked, replaced by silent disbelief. The king had just anointed not his son, but his daughter-in-law, as the future of the crown's legacy. It wasn't said outright, but it didn't have to be. The meaning was clear in every syllable, every pause. Catherine's poise, her grace, her strength qualities once deemed ceremonial, had just been elevated to sovereign potential. William's reaction was unreadable, his jaw clenched, but his expression betrayed no anger, only shock, the kind that comes when destiny shifts beneath one's feet. His eyes locked onto his father's, then to Catherine's. There was no accusation in them, only the weight of something unspoken. He knew, perhaps before anyone else, that this was no spontaneous remark. It had been brewing, building behind closed doors and whispered meetings, until finally, the king had chosen this night to make it known. Royal aides could feel the collapse before it became public. The protocol was shattered. There had been no draft declaration, no councillor's approval, no consultation with Parliament. A single unplanned sentence had just rewritten the monarchy's future. Phones buzzed in pockets. Subtle signals exchanged between press officers turned frantic. The private secretary's lips tightened, his eyes darting toward the archbishop, who looked equally stunned. It was chaos disguised as ceremony, unraveling quietly beneath centuries of decorum. Outside the cathedral, reporters began piecing together the message. "It is time for light to lead." The quote spread instantly, flashing across screens and phones around the world. Within minutes, speculation ignited. Headlines erupted before the service even ended. King hints at abdication plan, Catherine named successor in royal shock, monarchy faces historic shift at street polls. The media storm swelled faster than the palace could contain it. Within hours, the world had crowned Catherine in its imagination not officially, but symbolically. Yet, in that single declaration, Charles had not merely spoken as a monarch, he had spoken as a man confronting his own mortality, his own legacy. His reign, once viewed as the bridge between eras, had now become the bridge to something far more radical. The king's voice, calm yet resolute, carried the sound of finality. He had not abdicated, but he had done something even more powerful. He had redefined succession itself. And as Catherine sat in stunned silence, her hands folded in composure even as her heart raced beneath layers of grace, the weight of history began to settle upon her. Around her, the choir resumed softly, the ceremony struggling to continue, but the illusion of order had already fractured. The monarchy had been rewritten, not with a proclamation, but with a whisper disguised as destiny. But beneath the shock of the declaration, an older secret resurfaced, one that made Catherine's rise inevitable. Long before that fateful night, Catherine had made a vow not to her husband, not even to the king, but to the crown itself. It was a promise forged not in public ceremony, but in silence, A promise of loyalty, not to a man or an institution, but to the idea of monarchy, the ancient weight of continuity that had survived wars, scandals, and centuries of public doubt. Behind her gentle smile and her reputation for quiet grace was a woman shaped by patience and purpose. Her calm was not innocence, it was mastery. And within the guarded vaults of Kensington Palace, sealed in a folder marked only with the royal cipher, rested the letter that defined her fate, the one that tied her destiny to the crown's survival. It began years earlier, in the twilight of Queen Elizabeth's reign, when the monarch who had ruled longer than anyone else began to see her world shifting. The Queen had always known power when she saw it, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that listens, absorbs, and endures. Catherine fascinated her. She reminded Elizabeth of herself in her early years, underestimated, scrutinized, and yet unwavering in composure. Behind palace doors, the Queen took her under quiet mentorship. There were no formal lessons, no official acknowledgements, only private invitations to tea and long walks at Windsor, where words carried the weight of dynasties. The old monarch, aware that the next era would demand a new kind of strength, saw in Catherine something no one else did: empathy as power. It was during those private conversations that the concept of the stability doctrine was born, a discreet plan for the monarchy's preservation in uncertain times. It was never intended to be public. It wasn't rebellion or ambition. It was endurance. The doctrine proposed that the next generation of monarchy would need a figure who could unify the people emotionally, not just politically, someone the public would trust unconditionally, even if the crown itself faltered. And so, in the final years of her life, the Queen began preparing Catherine for that possibility. She didn't name her successor, she shaped her. She saw in her the calm that could survive chaos, the compassion that could quiet controversy. Catherine's silence, so often mistaken for submission, was her greatest strategy. She understood the monarchy's paradox, that to lead it, one must first learn to disappear within it. While the world speculated about her modesty or her deference, she was learning something far more powerful: restraint. Her ability to remain composed under scrutiny, to smile through turmoil, became both her weapon and her armor. And though the Queen's passing left her visibly heartbroken, it also left her carrying a private burden, the knowledge that she had been entrusted with something sacred. The toll was immense. Behind the public warmth lay exhaustion. Balancing motherhood, marriage, and monarchy demanded sacrifices no one outside the palace could imagine. Every headline, every whisper of tension between her and William became a test of endurance. William loved her deeply, but he too felt the shadow of her rising influence. He had been born into destiny, she had earned hers, and though he never said it aloud, he could feel what others dared to say only behind closed doors, that Catherine had become the people's queen long before she ever wore a crown. That truth was beautiful and dangerous, for as Catherine's quiet strength fortified the monarchy, it also drew new lines within it. Her loyalty had not just safeguarded the crown, it had redefined it. The old order, built on lineage and hierarchy, was slowly being replaced by something else: the power of devotion. But loyalty, when it shines too brightly, casts shadows of its own, and while Catherine's promise strengthened the monarchy's foundation, it would soon expose the fracture that ran deepest of all the war within the royal family itself. As the news of Charles's declaration spread, it didn't unite the family, it detonated it. Within hours, the calm veneer of royal composure cracked, and the tension that had been building for years finally erupted. William felt blindsided, stripped of certainty and dignity in a single stroke. The man who had been raised to inherit the throne suddenly found himself standing on unstable ground. The monarchy that had once been his destiny now looked at him as an afterthought, or worse, an obstacle. Across the Atlantic, Harry watched in silence. For him, the moment felt like poetic justice, a vindication wrapped in irony. For the first time since their mother's funeral, both brothers shared the same emotional betrayal. Behind the walls of Buckingham and Clarence House, the whispers began almost instantly. "The crown has chosen its favourite," murmured the courtiers. their words carrying both awe and fear. The king's declaration had not simply reshuffled power, it had redrawn bloodlines. The hierarchy of loyalty that had governed the royal household for decades was suddenly meaningless. Senior aides loyal to William began resigning quietly. Advisors in Charles's circle argued over damage control, and in the middle of it all, Catherine's silence became a storm of its own. She neither defended nor denied what had been implied. That silence, calm, deliberate, and regal, spoke louder than any statement could. William's fury grew in private. His conversations, once steady and measured, turned cold and clipped. To his closest confidants, he confessed his disbelief not only at his father's decision, but at the realization that Catherine had known more than she had revealed. It wasn't treason that stung him. It was the thought that she had prepared for this moment in quiet obedience to the crown's will, rather than his. He confronted her not with anger, but with disbelief, asking the question that every monarch fears. When did I stop being the future? Catherine's only answer was stillness, an unshakable grace that revealed nothing and protected everything. Her loyalty had never been to ambition, only to stability, and in that conviction, she found both her strength and her isolation. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Harry saw opportunity in chaos. He took to social media with a cryptic message, a quote, about truth, light, and liberation, which ignited a frenzy of speculation. Was he hinting at his father's health, at the changing line of succession, or was it a veiled jab at the family that had cast him out? Whatever his intention, the world devoured it, and the press ran wild. Meghan's team, ever strategic, leaned into the storm. Carefully timed interviews, subtle comments about justice and transparency began circulating through friendly networks. What should have been a royal transition turned into an international spectacle, a battle not for the throne, but for control of the narrative. Inside the palace, loyalty collapsed like fragile glass. Leaked memos revealed frantic calls for an emergency recouncil, a desperate attempt to contain what had already spiraled beyond their reach. Palace staff, long trained to uphold discretion, began feeding the press in exchange for protection or profit. Every detail of private conversations, every strained glance, every whispered argument between William and Charles became public property. The monarchy, long defined by control, was now governed by rumour. Through it all, Catherine remained immovable in the eye of the hurricane. To the public, she was serene, the only figure untouched by scandal. To those inside the family, her calm had become unbearable. She was the cause and the cure of the crisis. Her restraint was not weakness, it was survival. She understood that any reaction, any visible emotion, would deepen the wound. So, she endured. She became the silent embodiment of royal endurance, holding a collapsing institution together by sheer will. And yet, deep inside, she carried the ache of knowing that her very presence had divided the two brothers who once stood as the monarchy's future. The crown had chosen its favourite, but it came at a price. The bond between William and Harry, already strained by distance and ideology, was now fractured beyond repair. The palace could issue statements and denials, but no amount of protocol could disguise the truth. The monarchy was at war with itself, a war not fought in public speeches or official decrees, but in silence, resentment, and quiet calculation. And as the royal family fractured under the weight of its own legacy, the nation turned to the one figure who refused to lose control of Catherine herself. While the palace crumbled under rumour and rebellion, Catherine did what no monarch in waiting ever had. She said nothing. In an era ruled by sound bites and scandal, her silence was revolutionary. It became her weapon, her shield, and her voice all at once. She offered no interviews, no clarifications, no glimpses of emotion that the media could distort. Yet, her restraint spoke volumes. Worldwide, newspapers hailed her as the Queen of Grace. Television hosts debated her poise as though it were strategy, while royal historians called it divine instinct. But behind that serenity, Catherine was at war not with her enemies, but with herself. Every smile she offered was measured, every word rehearsed in the echo of her late mentor's wisdom. Never let them see your heart break. Her composure became the country's anchor. As the monarchy staggered under scrutiny, Catherine's presence restored an illusion of calm. When she appeared at public engagements, crowds cheered not out of curiosity, but out of devotion. In a nation weary of turmoil, she was the last figure untouched by scandal, the embodiment of what they wished the monarchy still was, pure, steady, untarnished. Children waved her photos in classrooms. Newspapers dubbed her the People's Queen, echoing a title that once belonged to Diana. But while the public saw grace, the palace saw danger. Catherine's rise was no longer symbolic, it was transformative. Her popularity had become so immense that even those closest to the throne began to fear it. Inside royal walls, admiration turned to resentment. Senior courtiers muttered that she had become too powerful without ever seeking power. Others accused her of outshining both king and heir, her calm interpreted as quiet rebellion. For William, it was unbearable. The man who had been groomed for the throne now watched as his wife through silence alone became its living embodiment. His withdrawal from public events was subtle at first, an illness here, a postponed engagement there. But soon, it became undeniable. The once unbreakable image of the royal couple began to fracture. Behind closed doors, their conversations grew shorter, their silences longer. Catherine's rise had not been of her own making, yet it carried the cost of isolation. The monarchy's public relations machine scrambled to regain control. Advisors launched what they called Project Renewal, a desperate attempt to redirect attention back to the king and his legacy. Speeches were crafted about continuity and unity, while Catherine's public appearances were limited to joint engagements carefully designed to dilute her dominance. But it was too late. The narrative had already shifted. To the world, she was not just a duchess or a consort in waiting, she was the future. Every restrained gesture, every compassionate glance was dissected as proof of her readiness. The same press that once sought to dismantle her now worshipped her. Yet Catherine felt none of the triumph they described. The irony of her ascent weighed heavily on her. She had not sought to lead, but to serve. Her heart remained loyal to both her husband and her father-in-law, yet fate had placed her above them in the eyes of the people. She had become the symbol of hope and renewal for an institution built on secrecy and control. The world called her light. But even light, she knew, casts shadows. Every step she took toward destiny seemed to leave a trail of fractures behind. Still, she endured. She smiled for the cameras, comforted strangers, and carried herself with the poise of someone who understood that history had chosen her whether she wanted it or not. She was the calm in the storm, the crown's last unbroken promise, and for a fleeting moment it seemed that peace might finally return to the monarchy. But peace within the palace was an illusion, one destined to shatter, because just when it appeared the chaos had subsided, a single forgotten document from the king's archive would reignite the storm, and this time it would threaten to consume them all. Hidden within the royal archives, an envelope marked serif was discovered. It was small, almost unassuming, yet inside it lay the blueprint for the most explosive revelation of the modern monarchy. Drafted years earlier by Charles himself, the document detailed a secret contingency, a last resort framework designed to preserve the institution in times of crisis. Its language was deliberate, its tone prophetic. It named Catherine not merely as a consort, but as a regent, should stability require divine feminine authority. Those words, buried in the vaults of history, would become the match that ignited a constitutional firestorm. The plan had been meant as a safeguard, never to be seen, never to be questioned. But when it leaked to the press, it transformed overnight from royal precaution into royal scandal, one that threatened to tear the crown apart from within. Parliament was the first to react, not with reverence, but with outrage. The revelation of Operation Seraph stunned the government and the church alike. How could a monarch, bound by centuries of tradition, dare to sketch his own line of succession? The Archbishop of Canterbury called for clarity, a word that thinly veiled alarm. Political leaders demanded accountability. The palace, which had already survived weeks of rumour and division, now faced something far more dangerous, a constitutional reckoning. For the first time in modern history, the people began to question not who would wear the crown, but how the right to rule was truly decided. Accusations began to swirl. Was Catherine's rise orchestrated from the start? Had Charles, in his frailty, manipulated the system to secure her power? Critics framed her as the architect of quiet ambition, the elegant usurper. Others saw something else entirely, a woman being punished for her loyalty. As the headlines multiplied, the public split into two nations, those who saw her as the future and those who saw her as the fracture. Yet outside the palace gates, crowds gathered in her defence. Flowers, letters and banners reading, "For stability, for Catherine," began to appear across London. The people's faith, once fractured, had found its anchor in her image once more. She had become, unwillingly, the monarch of hearts long before she ever wore a crown. Inside the palace, however, chaos reigned. William was thrust into an impossible choice: protect his family or defend the truth. Every path led to pain. If he defended the document, he appeared complicit in his father's scheme. If he denied it, he risked branding Catherine a fraud. The weight of his lineage crushed him. For the first time, William began to understand the loneliness of the crown and the unbearable price of its preservation. Advisers urged silence, but silence only deepened suspicion. And as the pressure mounted, one man sought to mend what the bloodline itself could not: the Archbishop of Canterbury. Behind closed doors, he convened secret meetings between the King, William, and Catherine. His mission was not political but spiritual: to restore order before faith in the monarchy dissolved completely. Those who were present described the encounter as haunting. Charles, frail but defiant, defended his decision as one made for the protection of the realm. Catherine remained quiet, her eyes lowered, her composure unbroken. William spoke little, his grief sharper than his anger. The Archbishop listened, prayed, and finally pleaded, "If the monarchy is to survive, it must do so in truth, not in secrecy." But truth, as the Crown knew too well, was the one thing it could never fully reveal. When Catherine finally spoke, it was not in the privacy of a meeting room, but before the entire world. The palace announced a televised address, brief, unscripted, and historic. Millions tuned in, expecting denial or defense. What they witnessed instead was dignity. Her voice was calm, her words deliberate, each syllable laced with the weight of quiet conviction. "I have only ever served," she said, "never sought." The statement lasted less than 10 minutes, yet its impact was seismic. There was no plea for forgiveness, no appeal for sympathy, only truth stripped of vanity. The world saw not a schemer, but a servant. And in that moment, public sentiment shifted once more. Her speech ended not with triumph, but with foreshadowing. For behind the controlled cadence of her words lay a tone of finality, as though she already knew what was coming next. Within the palace, those who knew the king best sensed it too. He had been silent since the leak, avoiding public appearances, withdrawing deeper into private reflection. His final command, written long before the scandal broke, had already foretold his path. For in the plan marked Seraph, there was one final line, overlooked by the press but understood by those who had read it fully. When peace demands surrender, the crown must yield. And so, as the storm reached its peak, with the nation divided and the world holding its breath, King Charles made one final, irreversible choice that stunned the world. On the morning of George's Day, Charles signed the document that ended his reign. It was a moment both inevitable and unimaginable. The quiet surrender of a king who had spent his life waiting to rule, only to find peace in letting go. The cameras caught the tremor in his hand as he pressed the pen to parchment, the ink bleeding into history with irreversible grace. For those watching, it was the end of an era for Charles. It was liberation. The weight of duty that had shadowed him since birth finally lifted, replaced by something purer, love for his country and faith in the woman who would carry it forward. As the ink dried, the monarchy was reborn. For the first time in British history, the crown was not passed through bloodline, it was bestowed through belief. Catherine was no longer the Duchess, she was destiny. The ceremony that followed mirrored the grandeur of coronations past, yet every detail carried new meaning. The symbolism had been inverted where past monarchs were crowned by divine right. Catherine's ascension was framed as an act of service. The same bells that had once been tolled for kings and queens of the empire now rang for something different: renewal. There were no gilded proclamations, no declarations of supremacy, only a single phrase etched in memory: the crown belongs to those who keep it alive. As she stepped forward, the air seemed to shift not with spectacle, but with quiet reverence. It wasn't the grandeur of royalty that moved the crowd, but the humility of leadership. The public reaction was overwhelming: tears, applause, and disbelief. Across the United Kingdom and far beyond, millions watched in silence, united by emotion rather than spectacle. Some wept for the end of tradition, others for the hope of something new. Crowds filled streets, lighting candles in windows, waving flags not for power, but for peace. Catherine had become a mirror for a nation's conscience, a reflection of its struggles, resilience, and longing for unity. She was no longer the quiet figure behind the throne. She was the throne, the living embodiment of the monarchy's rebirth. And though history would call it abdication, for many it felt like ascension, not of a crown, but of faith restored. Behind the grandeur, however, the personal cost unfolded in silence. That same morning, William's private letter found its way into Catherine's hands. It was brief, handwritten, and heavy with emotion. "I understand. Now," it read. "You didn't take my place, you saved it." It was not only forgiveness, but pride, the acknowledgement of a love that had survived power's cruelest test. For years, Catherine had carried the burden of being both wife and symbol, but in that moment, she was seen as both human and divine, vulnerable yet unbreakable. William's letter would never be published, but its spirit lingered in every gesture he made that day. Harry's reaction, as ever, was enigmatic. He remained silent. No statement, no interview, no message. Yet that silence was louder than any word he could have offered. The press called it cold. Those who understood the brothers' shared history recognized it as respect. Perhaps, in his own way, he too saw that the monarchy had become not a cage of privilege, but a vessel of endurance. For once, the House of Windsor seemed less like a family divided by ambition, and more like one bound by acceptance. The world's media crowned her the Queen of Renewal. International headlines hailed the moment as a triumph of modern monarchy, a blending of tradition and transformation. Some called it poetic justice, others called it divine correction, as though the late Queen herself had foreseen this day. Indeed, those closest to Elizabeth hinted that her final private letters contained subtle instructions, gentle nudges toward what she called the next light. Whether that was coincidence or prophecy, no one could say, but the implication was impossible to ignore. Perhaps even the greatest monarch of the past had seen Catherine's rise not as disruption, but as destiny. And as the sun dipped behind St. Paul's Cathedral, the same bells that had once tolled for morning now rang with triumph. Their echo rolled through the city, blending past and present, loss and renewal. The monarchy, long burdened by its history, had rediscovered its purpose not through lineage, but through grace. Catherine's reign began not with a roar, but with stillness, a moment of peace that seemed to cleanse the air. Yet even as the crowd celebrated, fate held one final twist for history, as it often does, was not finished rewriting itself. But history's final twist would come not from the throne, but from the people who once doubted her. Years later, historians would call it the era of light, a reign not born of ambition, but of grace. Catherine had not seized power, she had earned it, not through decree or dominance, but through quiet conviction. She never raised her voice, yet she reshaped an empire. Under her reign, the monarchy shed its centuries-old skin, moving from spectacle to substance, from rule to service. The age of conquest had long passed, but the age of compassion had just begun. In a world weary of scandal, division, and doubt, she became the calm in the storm, the rare ruler whose power came not from command, but from trust. The change did not happen overnight. It unfolded in small, deliberate acts, hospitals visited in silence, charities revived without fanfare, diplomatic gestures made not for cameras, but for conscience. The royal image that had once carried the weight of imperial legacy was reborn as humanitarian grace. Catherine's reign became defined not by the grandeur of the crown, but by the humility of its wearer. She reminded her people and the world that monarchy was not meant to dominate, but to heal. For decades, the institution had survived the illusion of authority. Under her, it began to thrive on authenticity. The vigil at St. Paul's, that fateful night of candlelight and confession, was remembered not as a scandal, but as a sacred turning point. It marked the moment the monarchy rediscovered its soul. Scholars wrote of it as the night of light, when tradition yielded to truth, and power bowed before purpose. In that night's stillness, history had pivoted quietly. Catherine's ascension had not been a rebellion against the past, but a redemption of it, a bridge between what the monarchy was and what it could be. Under her leadership, the royal family became more human than it had ever dared to be. Mistakes were acknowledged, wounds were healed, and divides that once seemed permanent began to fade. She ruled not with decree, but with empathy turning duty into devotion. Her voice, when she spoke, carried neither the weight of command nor the tone of superiority. It carried sincerity. Even those who once doubted her, who called her unworthy or unprepared, found themselves drawn to her quiet strength. She made history feel less like an inheritance and more like a responsibility shared by all. And yet, even as her legacy solidified, she refused to claim credit. History, she once said in a rare address, is not written by crowns, it's written by courage. Her words became immortal, etched not only into books but into the hearts of her people, and as generations passed, her story transcended monarchy itself. She became a symbol of what leadership could be, not power preserved, but peace achieved. Some whispered that the old monarchy might one day return, led by heirs who would walk the same sacred line between tradition and transformation. But even if that day came, it would bear Catherine's mark, the imprint of grace in a world that had long forgotten its value. Thus ends the vigil that began a revolution the night Catherine shone brighter than the crown itself.